Imagine waking up in a world where survival is not just a challenge, but the very definition of daily life. A world where every breath you take feels borrowed, where every new morning is not guaranteed, and where the comfort, safety, and stability of the modern age are unimaginable luxuries beyond the wildest dreams of the common person. This was the reality for the average medieval soul. There was no sense of security in the Middle Ages, no assurance that life today would look anything like life tomorrow. The medieval world was a place where the harshness of nature, the brutality of society, and the unpredictability of fate constantly reminded people of how fragile their existence truly was. To understand the misery woven into the fabric of medieval life, you need to picture yourself in a village far removed from the comforts you know today. No electricity to brighten the darkness, no clocks to organize your schedule, no heating systems to push away winter's icy breath. Just cold, damp mornings and long, grueling days. Water had to be fetched from rivers or wells, and even then, there was no guarantee it was safe to drink. Food was scarce, medicine was non-existent, and danger lurked in every corner of life, from disease, from hunger, from war, from nature itself. And yet in this world, ordinary people woke up each day because they had no choice. They rose before the sun, often with aching bodies, exhaustion weighing heavily upon them. They faced reality with hardened minds and weary hearts. Children, adults, and the elderly alike endured conditions we would struggle to imagine. Their lives were built on suffering, and suffering was accepted as a natural part of existence. Pain was not an exception, it was the rule. Imagine the very moment of birth. Even coming into the world was an ordeal that held a terrifying level of risk. A simple childbirth, something modern medicine can perform safely millions of times, was one of the deadliest moments a medieval woman would face. Mothers often bled to death, suffered fatal infections, or lost consciousness during labor, never to wake again, and the newborn child, half of all children, never saw their fifth birthday. Disease, malnutrition, or poor hygiene cut short countless young lives. A child falling sick was not a temporary problem. It was a crisis, a desperate fight against the unknown. There were no hospitals filled with trained doctors. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no emergency rooms humming with modern equipment. The local healer might try herbs or prayers, but their knowledge was limited, their remedies often ineffective. Illness was mysterious, frightening, and frequently fatal. Families watched helplessly as loved ones weakened, wasted away, and eventually died, often without understanding the cause. Sickness was viewed as punishment, or as the work of evil forces, or simply as fate. But whatever the reason, it was inescapable. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was shockingly low. Surviving childhood was already a victory. Reaching the age of 20 or 30 meant you were fortunate. Many adults carried chronic pain from years of labor, injuries, poor diet, and untreated medical conditions. Women were especially vulnerable due to repeated pregnancies and life-threatening births. And anyone who lived to see 40 was considered old. Elders in their 60s were rare, often respected with awe or regarded with superstitious curiosity, because most people simply didn't live that long. Even basic daily routines were exhausting and dangerous. Waking up meant stepping into a cold, dim room, usually a single space shared by an entire family, and sometimes their livestock. There were no clean showers, no fresh clothes waiting neatly folded, no warm breakfast prepared in a modern kitchen. Instead, there was smoke filling the air because homes had no chimneys, moisture collected in the walls and floors, creating a damp environment perfect for mold and pests. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Rats scurried in corners, spreading filth and disease. Everything smelled of sweat, smoke, animals, and damp straw. Your bed wasn't a mattress. It was a sack filled with old, bug-infested straw. Blankets were rough, cold, and rarely washed. Clothes were thick, coarse garments that scratched the skin, grew stiff with sweat and dirt, and provided minimal warmth. If you were lucky, you had more than one outfit. Most people didn't, but waking up was only the first challenge. The real suffering began with work. Work, in the medieval world, was not a job you chose. It was not a career or a profession. It was a duty imposed upon you by birth, given to you by the land, demanded of you by the Lord who owned everything around you. You weren't a farmer because you wanted to grow food. You were a farmer because you had no other option. Serfdom was the reality for most people, your life tied to land you didn't own, your labor owed to someone who lived comfortably in a manor or castle, far removed from your struggles. From the moment the sun rose, long before it became bright, you were expected to work in the fields. Men, women, children, everyone labored. The tools were crude, wooden plows, rusted sickles, dull blades. Farming wasn't an organized system with technology or machinery. It was back-breaking physical effort. You dug into the hard earth with your bare hands or simple tools. You hauled water, lifted stones, planted seeds, harvested crops, and carried heavy loads across uneven ground. Every season brought new dangers. Winter brought frostbite, hunger, and sickness. Spring and summer brought heat stroke, exhaustion, injuries, and infections. Rain turned fields into mud pits. Drought killed crops and animals. A single bad harvest could doom an entire village to starvation. And what did all this effort earn you? Barely enough food to stay alive. Bread made from coarse grains that cut into your gums. Ale brewed weekly because clean water wasn't available. Vegetables that were wilted, shriveled, or barely edible. Meat was a luxury reserved for holidays, if at all. Most peasants went months without tasting it. A chicken or a pig was too valuable to slaughter unless absolutely necessary. Hunting on the Lord's land was forbidden and punishable by brutal penalties, sometimes even death. But hunger was only part of the misery. You lived in constant fear. Fear of the weather, fear of failure, fear of your Lord's displeasure, fear of disease, fear of violence, fear of God's wrath. Superstition ruled everyday life. People believed that spirits, demons, or witches could influence their fate. Lightning storms, eclipses, sudden illness, or a poor harvest, all were seen as signs of divine anger or supernatural interference. War made life even worse. Conflict between nobles or kingdoms could sweep through peaceful villages without warning. Armies moved across the land like storms, and peasants stood helpless. Soldiers stole food, destroyed homes, trampled crops, and sometimes killed without hesitation. If you survived the invasion, the aftermath still left you starving and homeless. With all of this, it's easy to imagine why the average medieval person viewed life as a burden, a test, a long winter of suffering broken only by rare moments of joy. But even moments of celebration, the birth of a child, a wedding, a feast, were overshadowed by the fear that disaster could strike at any moment. Joy was fragile, temporary, and often followed by hardship. Religion was the only source of comfort for many. The Church explained suffering as part of God's plan, taught that life was a trial preparing people for the afterlife, and offered hope through faith. But it also controlled their beliefs, behavior, and knowledge. People lived in fear of sin, fear of eternal damnation, fear of divine punishment. Yet despite all of this, medieval people endured. They pushed through the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion. They endured losses, tragedies, and unimaginable hardships. They clung to hope through faith, rituals, love, community, and tradition. They worked the land, raised their children, and survived one day at a time. And when you understand just how painful, fragile, and uncertain the life of the average medieval person was, you begin to appreciate how extraordinary their strength truly was. They lived in a world that offered them almost nothing, but still they built cathedrals, formed societies, created art, and raised generations. Their misery was immense, but so was their resilience, and that resilience shaped the world we live in today. The medieval world was built on labor, not the kind we understand today, where tasks are divided into professions, where people earn wages, where rights and schedules exist. Medieval labor was different. For the average villager, work was not a job, it was existence itself. You worked because the land demanded it, because your survival depended on it, and because your lord required it. There was no alternative. To live was to labor, and to labor was to suffer. Imagine opening your eyes before dawn, long before the first hint of daylight. The air is cold, biting, and heavy with moisture. You pull yourself from a straw bed that has done nothing to protect your back from aching. Your muscles are stiff, your bones sore, and your stomach empty. Hunger is your daily companion, a familiar but unwelcome presence that wakes with you, follows you, and sleeps beside you. You don't have the luxury of ignoring it, but you also don't have the luxury of satisfying it. There is no breakfast waiting for you, no warm food. At best, perhaps, there is stale bread, so hard it can crack your teeth, dipped in weak ale to soften it enough to chew. Fresh drinking water is a rare luxury. Even if you could find it, there is always the risk that it carries sickness. You step out of your hut into the cold morning, and immediately the reality of your daily life floods back in. The fields stretch out before you, vast, unforgiving, demanding. Every season brings its own kind of work, and none of it is easy. Winter might allow fewer hours in the field, but the cold can kill. Summer offers longer days, but it drains your strength with heat and exhaustion. Spring and autumn are filled with planting and harvesting, backbreaking tasks that determine whether you will live through the next winter or starve. Most medieval people were peasants, though the word peasant hardly captures the complexity of their existence. Many were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked on. They did not own the soil beneath their feet. They did not control the fields they tended. They did not choose their labor. Their lives were tied to the will of a lord who might never touch a plow, never swing a sickle, never bend his back in the field, but who owned everything around them nonetheless. Your day begins with gathering the simple tools you have: a wooden hoe, a rough plow pulled by oxen, if you're lucky enough to have oxen, or a dull scythe that has been sharpened so many times it is almost worn away. These tools are your lifeline, but they are primitive. There are no machines to make work faster, no tractors, no engines, no irrigation systems, no fertilizers. The soil is hard, stubborn, and unforgiving. It only yields when forced to. You walk to the fields with others from your village. No one has the option to stay behind. Even children as young as 5 or 6 carry bundles of sticks, fetch water, or help gather whatever the adults reap. The elderly, those fortunate enough to survive into old age, do what they can. Everyone contributes because everyone must. If one person fails to work, everyone suffers. The first task might be to till the soil. You thrust the hoe into the earth again and again, breaking up the clumps, loosening the ground, turning it until it is ready for seeds. Each movement strains your back, pulls at your shoulders, and sends jolts of pain up your spine. But you keep going. There is no stopping. There is no rest until the work is done. If it is planting season, you drop seeds, barley, wheat, oat, into the shallow trenches you or others have carved. You cover them with soil and hope you have done it well enough that they sprout. If it is harvest season, you bend low for hours, cutting stalks of grain with a sickle until your hands blister and bleed. There is no protection for your skin, no gloves, no ergonomic tools. The labor leaves you raw, physically broken, but still forced to continue. The weather controls your fate. Rain can ruin everything. Drought can kill the crops. Frost can destroy an entire season's worth of work in a single night. But you have no way to stop the weather, no tools to protect your fields, no scientific knowledge to predict or prevent disaster. You can only hope, and hope is fragile. And then there is your Lord. You do not work these fields for yourself alone. In fact, you do not even work mostly for yourself. A large portion of everything you grow belongs to the Lord who owns the land. You pay him taxes in crops, in labor, in livestock, in money. If you ever even see money, much of what you produce does not feed your family, but fills the Lord's granaries. Only what remains is yours, and often what remains is barely enough. If you fail to meet your required labor or your expected taxes, the punishments can be severe: fines, more labor, confiscation of what little you have, and in extreme cases, physical punishment. The Lord's word is law. His castle is a symbol not just of wealth, but of power, a reminder that your life is not fully your own. Hunger is a constant pressure on your mind. Even in good years, the food you have is simple, repetitive, unremarkable. Bread made from coarse, unrefined grains is the staple of your diet. It is dense, heavy, and often difficult to digest. Because wheat is expensive, most bread is made from barley or rye, which can spoil easily and cause illness. Sometimes bread becomes moldy, and people eat it anyway because there is nothing else. Soup is another common meal, a thin broth made from whatever vegetables are available: onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips. Rarely seasoned, often bland, and always just enough to keep hunger at bay without ever eliminating it entirely. If you are fortunate, there might be some beans or peas in the pot. Meat is almost non-existent in your daily diet. It is too valuable to eat casually. Animals are wealth, and they are preserved for work, breeding, or special occasions. You might go months without eating a piece of meat. When you do, it could be something tough and stringy, heavily salted to preserve it because without refrigeration, fresh meat spoils quickly. And if you ever hunt for game on the Lord's land, you risk severe punishment. Poaching is seen not just as theft, but as a direct challenge to authority. Many peasants lose their hands, their freedom, or even their lives for trying to feed their families. Milk, cheese, and eggs are more available, but even these are limited. Animals often produce little, and whatever they produce must be shared among families. Dairy can also spoil quickly, which makes it unreliable. For drink, ale is safer than water. Water sources are often contaminated with waste, bacteria, and parasites. Ale, even weak ale, is boiled during brewing and tends to be safer to drink. Children drink ale, adults drink ale, everyone drinks ale. It is the liquid that sustains life, not because people prefer it, but because the alternative might kill them. Work is not limited to farming. There are other tasks, endless, repetitive, tiring tasks: repairing tools, building fences, caring for animals, collecting firewood from the forest, fetching water, washing clothes in icy streams, threshing grain, grinding flour, mending clothes, cooking meals, maintaining thatched roofs, clearing fields, digging ditches, and each of these chores consumes hours of time and energy. Women, often overlooked in history, carry equally heavy burdens. They work in the fields alongside men and then return home to cook, clean, care for children, prepare wool, spin yarn, weave cloth, tend gardens, make dairy products, and manage the household. Their work never ends. Even pregnancy does not excuse them. They labor until the day they give birth, and sometimes the day after. Childbirth itself is dangerous, often fatal, and yet life continues as if nothing happened. Children also work. There is no childhood as we know it today, no school for most, no time for play except in the small gaps between chores. A child old enough to walk is old enough to help. They scare birds away from crops. They gather firewood, they tend sheep, they fetch water, they help prepare meals. They learn early that life offers no ease, and hanging over all of this is the knowledge that no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you give, you cannot control your fate. One bad harvest, one harsh winter, one outbreak of disease, one unexpected storm, one command from your Lord, and everything changes. Starvation is always close. A poor harvest means you must ration your food, eat smaller portions, or go days with only a single meal. Families watch their children grow thin, their ribs visible, their eyes sunken. They pray for relief, but there is none. Work injuries are common. A slip of the sickle, a fall from a cart, a broken bone, a deep cut. Any injury can become fatal. Without medical knowledge or proper healing methods, infections spread, wounds fester, fevers set in. A simple accident becomes a death sentence, and yet, somehow, people continue. They wake up each day, carry their tools, and walk to the fields because they know that their survival depends on it. And not just their survival, the survival of their families, their communities, their entire village. Life revolves around the seasons. Spring brings hope. Summer brings exhaustion. Autumn brings anxiety. Winter brings fear. This cycle repeats every year, each season a test, each year a gamble with life itself. Despite all of this, there are rare moments of relief, a festival after a successful harvest, a feast day when the church permits celebration, a wedding that briefly lifts the spirits of the entire village, a birth that brings joy before the fear sets in. These moments are fleeting, but they matter deeply because they remind people that life, even in its harshest form, still holds small sparks of meaning. Still, the misery of labor defines medieval life. It shapes the body, breaks the spirit, and tightens the grip of poverty and dependence. It traps people in a cycle they cannot escape, and yet they endure. Their endurance becomes the backbone of society. Their suffering fuels the economy of kingdoms, their labor builds the wealth of nobles, their sacrifices carve the path of history. Through their relentless work they survive. Through their survival, they leave behind a legacy of strength, resilience, and perseverance, one that echoes through time, reminding us of the unimaginable hardships they faced just to live one more day. When you picture a medieval home, you might imagine a cozy cottage, a warm fireplace, a wooden table, and a peaceful life centered around simple comforts. But the truth is far from the romantic image often painted in films and fairy tales. For the common people of the Middle Ages, the place they called home was far from a sanctuary. It was not an escape from the hardships of life, but an extension of them, another battlefield of survival, another reminder of the harsh reality they were born into. The medieval home was cramped, dark, smoky, damp, uncomfortable, and often filthy beyond modern imagination. It was a place where privacy was non-existent, where disease spread easily, and where even the air you breathed could harm you. Imagine stepping into a typical peasant hut, a structure built not for comfort but for function. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, clay, dung, and sticks. The roof is thatched with layers of dried reeds or straw, and though it provides some insulation, it also attracts insects, rodents, and mold. The wind seeps through every gap, rain leaks through the roof. Cold drafts swirl around your ankles. There is no barrier between you and the harsh climate outside except for walls that constantly threaten to crumble with age. The home is a single room. One space serves as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, storage area, and occasionally even stable. The floor is nothing but packed dirt, uneven and damp. There are no tiles, no wooden boards, no mats, no rugs. When it rains, the ground grows wet. When it snows, the cold seeps upward through the earth itself. When spring arrives, insects invade. When winter comes, frost creeps across the floor, and in every season, the floor remains dirty, dusty, and mixed with the footprints of animals and people alike. In the medieval world, animals are not kept outside in separate barns the way we do today. They are precious sources of food, labor, warmth, and wealth. Losing an animal to thieves or predators could spell disaster for a family, so sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and sometimes even young cattle sleep inside the same room as the family. Their presence provides warmth during bitter winters but brings smells, noises, and filth that modern people would find unbearable. You hear animals shifting, scratching, bleating, snorting. You smell their waste constantly. You cannot escape it. It is simply part of your everyday reality. Smoke fills the room nearly always. Most medieval homes do not have chimneys. Instead, a small fire burns in a pit in the center of the room. Its smoke is meant to escape through a hole in the roof or drift out through the gaps in the walls. But more often than not, the smoke lingers, clinging to everything, choking the air, irritating eyes, coating the ceiling with black soot that sometimes falls into your food while you cook. Children cough, adults develop chronic lung problems, tears constantly form in your eyes as you sit near the fire, but you endure it because the fire is essential. It provides warmth, cooks food, dries wet clothes, and keeps wild animals away. The light is scarce. During the day, the only illumination comes from small windows, if your home has any at all. Most windows are no more than small holes covered with animal skins or wooden shutters. Glass is a luxury reserved for churches and wealthy homes. Inside, the room remains dim even at midday. Shadows cling to the corners, details fade into darkness, objects become invisible unless placed directly in the path of the firelight. At night, your only sources of light are the fire and perhaps a tallow candle. But candles are expensive and precious, made from animal fat and laboriously shaped by hand. They are saved for special occasions or emergencies, so night usually means darkness, deep, thick, suffocating darkness. The kind that limits your movements, the kind that encourages superstition, the kind that fuels your fears. Furniture is minimal, a rough wooden table, a few stools or benches, maybe a chest for storing what little clothing or valuables your family possesses. Beds, in the modern sense, do not exist. Instead, you sleep on piles of straw covered with old blankets, furs, or coarse woolen cloth. The straw is rarely replaced, infested with insects, and often damp. Lice and fleas live in it year-round. They crawl across your skin as you try to sleep. Rats scurry through the straw at night, searching for crumbs or warmth. You cannot escape them, and eventually you become used to their presence. The noise inside your home is constant. Children cry, animals stir, wind whistles through gaps, the fire crackles, people snore next to each other. Privacy is non-existent. You hear every breath, every movement, every whisper. Even intimate moments between husband and wife happen within a few feet of children and grandparents. It is not considered shameful, just another reality of life. Privacy, as we know it today, simply does not exist in the world of the medieval peasant. Food is prepared in the same room where everyone sleeps. You cook in a pot suspended over the central fire or in a cauldron resting on stones. Meals are simple and repetitive: thick soups, porridges, bread, and occasionally vegetables from your garden. The smoke from the fire permeates everything. The taste of soot becomes a familiar part of every dish. Your pots and pans are blackened by constant exposure to the flames. Cleaning them means scrubbing with sand or ash. Soap is rare and expensive, so everything remains coated with a layer of grease and grime. Water is fetched from a well, a stream, or a nearby river. There is no plumbing, there are no sinks, there are no bathtubs. Water is heavy to carry and precious to conserve. People rarely bathe. When they do, it is usually in cold water, outdoors, and infrequently. Clothes are washed even less often. The result is a world where odors linger: human sweat, animal musk, smoke, mold, wet earth, and decaying straw. These scents mix into a constant atmosphere that clings to every surface, every garment, every person. Pests are everywhere. Lice and fleas feast on your blood daily. They live in your clothes, your bedding, your hair. There is no escaping them. People share their homes with spiders, rodents, beetles, and worms. Flies swarm in summer. Mice and rats gnaw at food stores. Cats help control the rats but bring their own fleas. Every life form in medieval Europe seems to exist inside your home, except comfort and cleanliness. Seasonal changes dramatically affect the home. In winter, the cold is brutal. Frost forms on the inside of walls. The fire burns constantly, but its warmth rarely spreads far. You huddle close to the flames, leaving the rest of the room freezing. Children shiver under thin blankets. Water freezes in bowls. Your breath fogs in the air. Winters feel endless, and each one is feared. A harsh winter can kill livestock, destroy food supplies, and lead to starvation. Births in winter are especially dangerous for both mother and child. In summer, the home becomes unbearably hot. With no ventilation, the heat mixes with smoke and odors until the air feels thick enough to suffocate you. Insects multiply, buzzing around your food and biting exposed skin. The thatched roof, dried by the sun, becomes a fire hazard. One spark from the hearth can ignite it. Entire villages have burned to the ground from a single uncontrolled flame. Autumn and spring bring their own challenges. Rain leaks through the roof. Mud covers the floor. Dampness spreads through walls, rotting wood, encouraging mold growth that affects your lungs and makes sleeping uncomfortable. Clothes never fully dry. Everything smells of moisture. Even the straw in your bedding begins to rot. Disease thrives in such a home, with people and animals living together with poor ventilation, with damp conditions and a lack of hygiene. Sickness spreads rapidly. A single cough can move through a household in days. A fever can become deadly. Parasites, intestinal worms, and skin infections are common. Children suffer the most. The elderly, if they survive at all, struggle constantly. Illness is not an occasional problem. It is a constant threat. What little privacy you have is emotional rather than physical. Families share every moment. They eat together, sleep together, work together, and survive together. Life is communal, intimate, and exposed. Arguments erupt easily because personal space doesn't exist. Tension fills the air as much as smoke, but families depend on each other completely. There is no government support, no social services. Your survival relies on the people inside this cramped hut. Despite all this, families attempt to create moments of comfort where they can. A small wooden spoon carved by a father, a woolen blanket woven by a mother, a handful of flowers placed on a table, a drawing etched into a piece of wood. These tiny acts, and significant to us today, bring warmth and meaning to medieval life. Families take pride in keeping their homes tidy, even when tidy means sweeping dirt to the side or arranging tools neatly. The home is also the center of tradition. Stories are told by the fire at night. Songs are sung during long winter evenings. Festivals and feast days include decorating the hut with greenery. cooking special meals, or bringing neighbors together. Children play with homemade toys, wooden dolls, spinning tops, bundles of rags tied to form animals. There are moments of laughter, joy, and connection that shine through the darkness of the living conditions. But even during joyful moments, the fragility of life is always present. A fire could destroy your home, a storm could collapse the roof, a sickness could break the family, a bad harvest could leave you without food to cook. Every comfort is temporary, every improvement is limited by poverty, every choice is constrained by necessity. The medieval home reflects the larger world, unpredictable, harsh, and unforgiving. It is a microcosm of the human struggle against nature, poverty, and fate. Yet it is also the heart of medieval resilience. People survived not because their homes protected them, but because they learned to endure the discomfort, adapt to the challenges, and find meaning even in the bleakest surroundings. To step into a medieval home is to witness the intersection of suffering and strength. It is to understand that comfort was rare, but determination was constant. It is to see how people lived not with luxury, but with perseverance. And through this perseverance, they built families, passed down traditions, held on to hope, and gave rise to future generations. Their homes were not shelters in the way we know them today. They were battlegrounds of survival, crucibles of community, and monuments to the endurance of the human spirit. And every detail, the dirt floor, the smoky air, the crowded space, the constant presence of animals and pests, tells the story of a world where life was undeniably hard, yet unmistakably alive with the will to continue. War in the medieval world was not a distant rumor or something that happened far away between armored knights on horseback. It was an ever-present shadow that hung over the lives of ordinary people, an unpredictable storm that could break at any moment, tearing apart everything they had built. It was not glorious, not noble, not heroic. It was a brutal, relentless force that crashed into the lives of peasants, villagers, tradespeople, and even nobility with devastating consequences. Violence was woven deeply into the fabric of medieval society. It was not the exception, it was the expectation. Imagine living in a time when the sound of hooves approaching on the horizon could mean the end of your home, your crops, or your life. Imagine hearing rumors that a lord, a baron, or a king had decided to wage war against one another, and knowing instantly that you, someone who had no say in politics, no part in the disputes, would be forced to pay the price. Wars erupted for countless reasons: land disputes, political rivalries, succession crises, personal grudges, or even insults. A single argument between noblemen could spiral into a conflict that engulfed thousands of peasants. And when the banners were raised and the swords drawn, the first victims were almost always the people with the least power. Armies had to be fed, soldiers had to be paid, horses needed to be stabled, weapons needed maintenance. None of these things were provided by the nobles who initiated the wars. Instead, they were taken by force, taken by demand, taken by those marching with weapons in their hands and authority on their tongues. When an army approached your village, you did not prepare to fight. You prepared to hide, you prepared to flee, you prepared to beg for mercy. Soldiers, whether they were loyal knights, hired mercenaries, or desperate levies, came like a thunderstorm. They entered homes and took everything they wanted: food, grain, livestock, tools, blankets, clothing. They would seize your only ox, the one animal that allowed your family to plow fields. They would take your daughter or wife to serve them, or worse. They would burn fields, trample crops, destroy wells, and leave behind ruin that would take years to recover from, if recovery was possible at all. The average medieval person had no weapons, no armor, and no training. They had hoes, plows, and wooden sticks. They were defenseless. They were often ordered to join the army anyway. At a lord's command, peasants would be taken from their fields, handed spears or farm tools, and thrown into battles they barely understood. Men who had spent their entire lives bent over soil were suddenly asked to stand in formation and face professional warriors. What chance did they have? They were nothing but bodies, disposable, replaceable, forgettable. Many of them died before the battle even began. Marching long distances in harsh weather with little food or water killed thousands. Disease spread quickly in cramped encampments where hygiene was non-existent. Camps were infested with lice, fleas, and rats. Contaminated water caused dysentery, which killed more soldiers than actual combat. A medieval army was not an organized machine of discipline and strategy. It was a chaotic mass of hungry, dirty, exhausted men moving under poor leadership and even poorer conditions. And for those who actually reached the battlefield, what awaited them was a kind of horror we struggle to comprehend today. There were no clean gunshot wounds, no controlled explosions, no modern medical evacuation. Medieval combat was raw, intimate, and incredibly violent. Soldiers fought face to face with swords, axes, spears, maces, and bows. They swung heavy weapons that shattered bones, crushed skulls, and split flesh. Arrows pierced throats, eyes, and lungs. A single moment of hesitation meant a blade sliding across your stomach or a hammer delivering a killing blow to your skull. Many soldiers died instantly, but many more died slowly, screaming in pain, bleeding out on the ground while the battle raged around them. Wounded men were often left where they fell because medical care on the battlefield was minimal to non-existent. If you were unlucky enough to survive with an injury, infection could claim you days later. Doctors were rare, and their knowledge was primitive. They might attempt to cauterize wounds with red, hot iron, or apply dirty bandages that only worsened the infection. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Most wounded soldiers begged for death just to escape the agony, but the violence did not end on the battlefield. When a city or castle fell, the worst horrors were unleashed. Siege warfare was among the most destructive and terrifying experiences of the medieval era. Cities could be surrounded for months or even years, cut off from food, water, and supplies. Starvation set in quickly. Bread ran out. Vegetables and grains were eaten down to the last scrap. People slaughtered animals they would normally never consider eating. Cats, dogs, rats. When even those were gone, starvation drove some to madness. Historical records tell stories of people boiling leather shoes to eat or grinding bones into powder to mix with water. Some accounts, though rare, even mention cannibalism in extreme cases. Inside these besieged cities, disease spread rapidly. Corpses piled up in the streets, the smell of death clung to the air, water sources were contaminated, people became weak and delirious, desperation was everywhere, and all the while, the enemy outside the walls launched rocks, fire, and disease-ridden projectiles with catapults. Siege engines, massive wooden towers, battering rams, and trebuchets were constructed to tear down walls or breach gates. Every rumble of these machines filled people with dread, and when the walls finally fell, when the enemy poured into the city, it was chaos. Soldiers rushed through the streets, killing anyone who resisted or got in their way. They looted homes, stripped corpses, and set buildings ablaze. Women faced horrific violence. Children were killed or taken as slaves. Men who surrendered were often executed to send a message. A city captured by force was rarely spared. The brutality served as a warning to others. The aftermath of war was often worse than the war itself. Villages lay deserted, fields were burned, wells were poisoned, families were scattered or wiped out. Survivors had to rebuild everything from scratch with little to no help. Famine often followed wars, killing more than the battles had. Poverty deepened. Crime increased as desperate people turned to theft just to survive. War was not an event. It was a cycle of destruction that could last decades. Even in peacetime, violence remained a constant companion. Bandits and highwaymen roamed the countryside, preying on travelers and isolated villages. Roads were unsafe, especially at night. Wolves and bears threatened livestock and sometimes even people. Raids from rival tribes or neighboring regions could happen without warning, especially in borderlands. And then there was the violence within medieval society itself. Punishments for crimes were severe and often designed to terrify the public. Thieves could lose hands. Murderers might be hanged, beheaded, or broken on a wheel. Accused witches, heretics, or rebels faced brutal torture, burning, stretching, crushing, designed to extract confessions. Justice was not fair or consistent. It was brutal, arbitrary, and heavily influenced by status. A noble might get a fine for a crime that would cost a peasant his life. Public executions were treated as entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch as criminals were punished, cheering or jeering as if attending a festival. People brought their children to witness these horrors, believing it would teach them obedience and fear. Violence was normalized from childhood. It shaped the medieval mind, hardened the medieval heart, and became part of the medieval world. And war, even when it wasn't happening, was always coming. Every person lived with the knowledge that the next fight, the next raid, the next uprising could erupt without warning. Peace was fragile, stability was temporary, safety was an illusion. Nobles argued, kings plotted, rebels whispered, and mercenaries waited for someone to hire them. There was no era untouched by conflict, but perhaps the greatest tragedy of medieval warfare was how little it changed. After all the destruction, all the death, all the suffering, life for the peasants remained the same. The borders might shift, kings might change, and castles might crumble, but the people at the bottom, the majority, gained nothing. They returned to their fields, rebuilt their homes, reburied their dead, and resumed the endless cycle of labor and fear. War was not a story of knights and chivalry, as Hollywood sometimes portrays it. It was a story of villages burned, families torn apart, hunger, disease, and lives shattered. It was the story of countless people whose names were never recorded and whose suffering was never remembered. But despite this constant violence, medieval people endured. They adapted. They found small moments of peace amid chaos. They built communities, raised children, tended fields, and held on to hope. They learned to read signs in the sky, to listen for danger, to rebuild after every loss. Their perseverance is why we know their world today, not through tales of glory, but through the sheer force of human resilience that kept them alive despite the endless violence that surrounded them. If there was one enemy more feared than war, more unpredictable than violence, and more merciless than any king or army, it was famine. Hunger was not something that came and went. It was a constant presence, lurking like a silent predator. Medieval people lived close, terrifyingly close, to starvation every single day. A bad harvest didn't just mean times are tough. It meant death, slow, painful, unforgiving death. Imagine standing in a field you have worked on for months, bending your back in labor, sweating under the sun, praying for rain, terrified of storms, hoping the soil gives life instead of taking it. And then imagine watching the sky darken at the wrong time of year. Imagine hail slamming down, smashing young crops. Imagine frost hitting in late spring, killing newly sprouted plants. Imagine locust swarms blotting out the sun and devouring every green leaf within hours. Imagine a sudden drought turning soil into dust that slips through your fingers like sand from an hourglass. You lived with the knowledge that nature could turn against you at any moment. There was no crop insurance, no relief effort, no government food program. If the harvest failed, you suffered, and if it failed badly enough, you died. The medieval world was built on farming, primitive farming, relying purely on the mercy of weather, crude tools, and outdated knowledge. The soil was often overworked and depleted because peasants didn't have the freedom or resources to rotate fields properly. They planted the same crops on the same land year after year. Their tools were basic: wooden plows tipped with iron, crude sickles, and hand tools that broke easily and required constant repair. Even in a good year, food was barely enough. In a bad year, people were one small disaster away from catastrophe. Hunger started quietly. It whispered first, parents skipping meals so their children could eat, bread loaves growing thinner, barley mixed with sawdust to stretch it further, people boiling old bones to make broth, children crying in the night from hunger pangs, farmers walking through their fields, praying desperately for signs of growth. But eventually, the whisper grew into a roar. In true famine, the body becomes an enemy. Muscles shrink, vision blurs, strength fades, and the mind changes. Hunger distorts emotions, creates desperation, ignites paranoia. People become shadows of themselves, their cheeks hollow, their ribs protruding, their eyes sunken. In a world already plagued by disease and exhaustion, starvation pushed people over the edge. Villages that once echoed with laughter and the chatter of ordinary life fell silent. People were too tired to talk, too weak to walk, too hopeless to dream. And the worst part, famine rarely came alone. It was often accompanied by disease. Malnutrition weakened the body's defenses, making even small illnesses deadly. Children died in staggering numbers. The elderly faded quickly. Adults pushed themselves until their bodies simply gave out. But hunger was not just a natural disaster, it was also a human-made one. The medieval social system ensured that the lowest lived closest to starvation, even in good times. Lords demanded taxes in the form of grain, livestock, and labor. Even when peasants barely had enough to survive, the church required tithes. Kings imposed levies to fund their wars. Merchants exploited shortages to raise prices. So even if a village managed to survive a poor harvest, those above them could make starvation inevitable. Imagine the crushing feeling of watching a cart roll away from your village, filled with grain you grew with your own hands, grain taken as tax, while your children sat at home with empty bowls and hungry stomachs. This was the reality. Famine was especially devastating because it stripped away everything: food, dignity, humanity, order. Law broke down when stomachs were empty. Theft became common, not out of greed, but necessity. People stole from granaries, raided storehouses, and sometimes even dug up freshly buried bodies, not for food, but for the clothing or jewelry they had been buried with. In many famines, accounts describe people eating grass, roots, tree bark, and even clay. Chronicles from medieval Europe are filled with horrifying details. One account describes people grinding acorns into paste. Another talks about families boiling nettles. Another still mentions villagers chewing on leather belts, boots, and old harnesses softened in water. Hunger doesn't break a person all at once. It wears them down day by day, meal by missed meal. It turns strong men into fragile skeletons. It makes mothers unable to produce milk. It causes children to shrink, their growth stunted forever. And worst of all, hunger strips away hope. When you hear stories of medieval people praying for rain, holding processions through villages, or begging saints for mercy, it is not the dramatic religious ritual we imagine today. It was desperation, a plea for survival, and yet famine was not the only monster stalking the medieval world. Where hunger entered, disease soon followed, and no disease was as feared, as destructive, or as infamous as the plague. The plague was not a sickness, it was an apocalypse, a biblical punishment, a force that erased entire communities from the map. The most notorious of all was the Black Death, a plague so deadly that it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few years. But medieval people didn't just face one plague. Waves returned again and again, every decade, every generation. Many people lived through multiple outbreaks, each one bringing fresh terror. Imagine a world where illness comes suddenly, where a person who is healthy in the morning could be dead by nightfall, where symptoms appear violently, fever, chills, vomiting, hallucinations, and the infamous buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes that filled with pus and blood. The sight and smell of these swollen boils were horrific. People feared touching the sick. They feared breathing the same air. They feared that simply being near a plague victim meant they too would soon die. Sometimes entire families were wiped out within days. Sometimes entire villages were abandoned, every resident dead or fled. Survivors walked through empty streets, past doors marked with crosses to warn others, plague inside. They watched carts rumble by, filled with corpses piled like firewood, destined for mass graves dug in haste. Burials were rushed, prayers were short. Priests died so often that there were not enough clergy left to perform rituals. Doctors wore strange bird, like masks stuffed with herbs, not because they worked, but because they believed the scents would protect them from bad air. Plague destroyed society from the inside. Everyone feared everyone else. Neighbors locked themselves indoors. Parents abandoned children. Brothers refused to help sisters. Human bonds broke down under terror. But plague was just one enemy. Medieval life was filled with disease, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, influenza, and fevers with no names. A simple cut from a rusty tool could kill. Drinking contaminated water could kill. Eating spoiled food could kill. Living in a home filled with smoke, fleas, and mold could kill. The medieval body was constantly under attack. Weak immune systems, poor hygiene, malnutrition, and overcrowded living conditions created a perfect environment for sickness. People didn't understand germs or bacteria. They didn't know how diseases spread. They believed illness came from sin, demons, or bad spirits. They tried remedies like bloodletting, prayer, charms, and herbal mixtures. Some worked slightly, most didn't, and the suffering caused by illness was relentless. A fever that might keep a modern person home for a day could kill a medieval villager. A cough that today is harmless could turn into fatal pneumonia. A small infection in the foot could lead to amputation or death. Even childbirth was one of the most dangerous medical events. For women, giving life meant risking death every single time. Infection, blood loss, and obstructed births claimed countless lives. If the mother survived, the baby often did not. Many families lost multiple children before they reached adulthood. Death hovered over every cradle, but famine and disease created a deeper suffering, emotional suffering, the psychological toll of constant fear, constant uncertainty, and constant grief. Medieval people lived with more death in a week than many modern people see in a lifetime. The average person buried siblings, children, friends, and parents regularly. Imagine the weight of that grief. Imagine a life where mourning never ends. Imagine knowing, truly knowing, that your loved ones could be gone tomorrow. Yet medieval people kept going. They worked, they prayed, they sang, they told stories. They held festivals. They continued the fragile routine of life because stopping meant giving up entirely. And through all this suffering, they developed a world, shaped by fear and hope, fear of nature, fear of God, fear of the unknown. Hope for survival, hope for blessings, hope for an afterlife where suffering ended. They believed suffering had meaning, that it was part of divine will, that it tested their souls, that endurance would earn them peace. This belief didn't remove the pain, but it gave them a reason to keep going, and that is perhaps the greatest tragedy and triumph of medieval life. People endured the unbearable not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. Their strength was born of necessity, their resilience forged in hardship, their courage shaped by suffering. They lived through famine, through plague, through hunger so deep it hollowed their bones, and through sickness so cruel it wiped out entire communities. And still they continued, because even in a world of endless misery, the human spirit refuses to die. For all the misery, all the hunger, all the suffering, all the darkness that defined medieval life, the most remarkable truth is that medieval people did not simply collapse under the weight of their world. They endured, they adapted, they lived, and they did so with a resilience that feels almost impossible to comprehend from a modern perspective. Because in a world where survival was uncertain, where danger lurked at every corner, where death could come from war, famine, sickness, childbirth, or even a single unlucky moment, the medieval human spirit still found reasons to go on. Not because life was easy, but because giving up meant certain destruction. Despite the brutal conditions, people carved out meaning amid chaos. They found comfort in community, faith, and tradition. They found joy in moments we might consider small or insignificant today. They laughed, told stories, played games, danced during festivals, fell in love, raised children, and celebrated victories, however small, because these moments allowed them to feel human in a world that tried constantly to strip humanity away. Imagine a medieval village on a rare calm evening. The day's labor has ended, the tools have been put away, the wind carries the smell of baked bread drifting from a hearth. Inside a small, smoky hut, a family gathers around the glow of a fire. The light flickers on their tired faces. A child sits on the floor, listening intently as a parent tells a story, perhaps one about dragons, heroes, saints, or spirits. Such stories weren't just entertainment, they were hope. They were lessons. They were reminders that even in a world where everything felt fragile, imagination and belief could provide warmth the cold world could never steal. This sense of togetherness, this shared life, was a powerful force. Villagers relied on one another in ways often lost in the modern world. They worked together to plant and harvest crops. They helped repair roofs, build fences, and tend livestock. In times of sickness or loss, neighbors brought food, tended fields, or cared for children. Life was harsh, but no one survived alone. Community was not a choice, it was a lifeline, and festivals, despite poverty and suffering, were essential. A good harvest might be rare, but it was celebrated with dances, singing, feasts, and games. Even in years of struggle, people made room for weddings, christenings, and seasonal celebrations. Villagers wore their best or least worn clothes. They decorated their homes. They prepared whatever food they had, even if it meant stretching thin supplies just for one night of joy. They gathered in village squares to play instruments, fiddles, drums, pipes, and to dance in circles, clapping in rhythm. These celebrations were short breaks from hardship, but they were powerful, moments that reminded medieval people that they were more than their suffering. Love, too, persisted. Young people still whispered to each other by riversides, dreamed of marriage, exchanged tokens, woven strings, carved wooden charms, small flowers. People sought companionship in a world where tomorrow was never promised. Marriages weren't always romantic, but affection grew in many households. Husbands and wives learned to rely on one another, to share burdens, to raise children together, to comfort each other through tragedy. Parents held newborns with the same tenderness we feel today, even knowing the world might take them too soon. That love was brave. Loving anything in the medieval world was brave. Religion played a profound role. In a world of uncertainty, faith was one of the only constants. Churches provided more than sermons. They were places of community, learning, music, and refuge. Religion gave structure to life. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, holidays, saints' days, fasts, and feasts. People prayed not because they were naive, but because prayer gave them a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. It offered hope when everything else was despair. It promised meaning when suffering felt pointless. It painted a larger picture where the hardships of life were temporary trials before eternal peace. That belief helped millions endure. And then there was curiosity, the spark of the human mind that no amount of misery could extinguish. Even in the darkest ages, people asked questions. They tried to understand the world. They studied the stars, wrote manuscripts, composed music, built machines, and experimented with herbs. Monasteries preserved knowledge that would eventually ignite the Renaissance. Craftsmen invented new tools. Blacksmiths discovered better ways to shape iron. Builders constructed cathedrals so magnificent that they defy imagination even today. These structures didn't rise because life was easy. They rose because humans, even in hardship, seek beauty. Medieval people weren't mindless peasants stumbling through misery. They were thinkers, dreamers, storytellers, workers, believers, and survivors. Their world was violent and cruel, but they pushed forward because they believed in something greater, whether that something greater was God, family, community, honor, love, or simply the hope that tomorrow might be kinder. And while the elites lived differently, luxury in the castle, feasts on long tables, silks and spices from far-off lands, they too faced fears and uncertainties. Nobles feared political betrayal. They feared raids. They feared famine, illness, and war just like everyone else. Even kings could die from a simple infection or lose entire families to plague. No one was immune. But if medieval life was filled with so much death and despair, then why did people care about music? Why did they carve beautiful designs into wood, metal, and stone? Why did they embroider patterns onto cloth or illuminate manuscripts with brilliant colors? Why did they sing songs passed down through generations? Why did they decorate their homes for holidays or carry lucky charms? Because beauty was a kind of rebellion. Creating something beautiful was a way of saying, we are still here. We are still human. We will not be defined by suffering alone. Medieval people weren't just shaped by misery. They shaped their world through endurance. Consider the courage of a woman giving birth, knowing each labor could be her last, yet still hoping for a child who might bring laughter into her home. Consider the bravery of a farmer who woke before dawn every day, even in freezing temperatures, to plow fields that might or might not feed his family. Consider the determination of monks who spent their entire lives copying manuscripts by hand to preserve knowledge for the future. Consider the child who lost siblings, parents, and friends, yet still learned to smile again. Consider the soldier who marched into battle not for glory, but because his village depended on him. Consider the healer who did her best with herbs and hope, trying to save lives with almost no tools. Every medieval person carried their own silent story of survival, and humanity did more than survive. It advanced, it grew, it evolved. Every generation built on the resilience of the last. The medieval world, for all its suffering, laid the foundation for everything that came after. Universities, legal systems, scientific curiosity, architectural masterpieces, languages, literature, and cultural traditions that still echo today. The people who endured famine, plague, war, and oppression also planted the seeds of the modern world. That is why medieval life, despite its misery, is not a story of despair, but a story of strength. A story of people who lived without guarantees, who faced hardships we can barely imagine, yet who never surrendered to hopelessness. A story of a world where death was near, but where life was still cherished. A world where survival was fragile, but humanity was fierce. A world where misery was constant, but so was resilience. Their victories were small, but they mattered. A newborn taking its first breath. A family harvesting enough food for winter. A village rebuilding after a raid, a couple marrying after months of waiting, a book completed by a patient monk, a song sung during a festival, a candle lit in prayer. These moments were the small flames of hope that kept the medieval world alive, lighting the darkness one flicker at a time. And through all these moments, the greatest truth emerges. Medieval people were not defined by their suffering. They were defined by how they responded to it. They were defined by endurance, by faith, by community, by love, by the stubborn belief that life, no matter how brutal, was worth living. Their resilience is the reason we exist today. Every one of us carries the blood of someone who survived the medieval world, someone who survived plague, famine, war, violence, and fear. Their endurance is written into our DNA. Their strength lives on in us. So yes, medieval life was filled with endless misery, but it was also filled with humanity, with courage, with an unbreakable spirit that refused to be crushed. And that is the true story.